spot and get yourselves situated for our study. That'd be great. We are continuing in our look into the history and geography of the Bible story. As we begin this morning, let's take a moment and bow together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for your word. We thank you for every single soul that has helped bring that message to us. We thank you for the kingdom of God and the blessings that you shower upon us. Please help our faith to grow. Help us to use wisdom in our life and our speech. And we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. So again, we are in the kind of a two-step process for this morning. Number one, we're going to finish out the last little bits of the arrival of the kingdom, which is more of a what does the Bible teach theological consideration of a big part of the story. And then we're going to immediately move into Paul's work in evangelism and spreading the kingdom. And so that'll be the bulk of our time in class today. If you're looking for hey, where are we in the Bible for this? This is going to be approximately Acts chapter 9 to Acts chapter 14 as a focused section of the New Testament when we're looking at Paul's work. And we're going to make a couple of stops in two different kind of corners when we look at those. Part of it will be geographic, looking at maps again, looking at the sequences, because this story is told through the lens or life of Paul. So his travels often kind of set the structure for the story as it unfolds. And then we'll do some of the history and archaeological side. We pay attention to what the land looks like, what the historical data that supports the Bible story looks like, and kind of make those interconnections. So we'll be looking at some of that too as we work our way through this. Just so you know, very soon we'll be having one of our planned review quizzes. So it's a good time to start thinking back to the stories from Genesis, maybe get out those maps, maps number 1 through about number 7 or so. It would be a good review space. If you have the handbook for it, they're going to be in there as well. If you've got some of those emails, they're there attached in some of our earlier emails. We're looking at this first, though, and thinking about this statement from Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, where God is summing together some truths through the writing of Paul about the nature of the kingdom of Christ. And I want to indicate a couple of things that are important beyond the archaeological and historical side. When we talk about the church in the 21st century context, we have to remind ourselves that we're paying attention to a number of facets when we say that word. When we say, this is about God's kingdom, that is one way to refer to big picture ideas. We say the same thing at times when we say we're talking about God's church. That word church, as used in the New Testament, is a Greek word ekklesia. The word itself is a fairly generic term. It does not have, in the language of its origin, a special meaning. You actually find it used elsewhere in the New Testament to describe something that we would probably never associate with the church. That's a mob. And so the angry mob in the book of Acts is also called an ekklesia, because it's saying these are people who are special in relation to everybody else. And then in the language, it defines why they're special. So church, as used in the Bible, is not a special word, but now, as used in English, it's a very special word. We've made that word mean some things. And by the way, sometimes it doesn't always mean the thing that we intend. We've kind of attached extra unintentional baggage to the phrase. Example. What's this right here? That's a baptistry or baptismal area, but it's also sheetrock, right? And it's also the building. And it's also any number of other things. So we know that intellectually. We immediately know that by our experiences, by our context. But when we say church, we have to clarify. When we do that, the church building. Okay, that's what we mean. Or the building, if we're trying to be appropriate that way. Nothing wrong with any of those terms. So when we're talking about God bringing about the kingdom, the Son, in the fullness of time, we're now expanding our mind just a little bit and saying, okay, we're not talking about just one thing. We're talking about the kingdom, the church, the Messiah or the Anointed One, the body of Christ. We're talking about all the other various phrases that the Bible uses of equal value to say this is it. Church of the firstborn ones. There's a number of designations in Paul's writing to the church at Corinth, to the Romans. All of them are equal value and saying this is the right time for all of these ideas to come together in God's Son. And as such, then we come back to history and say, okay, now why now? Why is it right now? And last week we asked a similar question, why not today instead of 2,000 years ago? Well, Roman Empire, very cosmopolitan. There's a lot of interconnectedness between all of the world in that area. At this point, this entire circle around the Mediterranean is essentially unified. And there are Jews scattered throughout all of those communities. All those factors then historically help us understand how quickly the gospel spreads, which is, again, a religion, a method of practice that is one of choice. Hebrews chapter 8 and chapter 10 make this argument for us as well, that describe one of the key differences between the Old Testament and the law. Very simple sequence. You are born into Israel and you are taught of God. Whereas in Christ, you are taught of God and then born into Israel, born into the kingdom, born into the church. That's Hebrews 8 and 10 as kind of short summaries. And so Christianity only exists on the premise that people believe that Jesus Christ lived, that he died, and that he rose. Those key elements then are what is essential for the full message to be understood as to whom Jesus is. Hebrews 5, 8, and 9. Though he was a son, yet he learned or experienced obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who, again, obey him. That helps us kind of catch some other good ideas as well, that this kingdom is a choice. The choice includes the willing obedience, and our King, our Messiah, also is actually engaged in a form of his own educated obedience too, because he's following after the Father's plan. Even he doesn't know all the details, and he says that openly and plainly. So, quick question before we move to Paul's work in this. Any thoughts on the kingdom side of the historical look at the church? Or extra questions? Things that you're curious about always fit in this basket too. I'll take that as an example of two things coinciding. One, the time change, and two, potential displacement from your caffeine sources. You know, like you're a little off key from when you had your morning coffee. We'll catch up. It'll be there. So now, as we think about Paul, we're shifting past textually. Maybe the first 8 chapters of the book of Acts kind of help us see the beginning history of the first century church. You see a lot of Jerusalem focus there, a lot of focus on the events that are taking place there. And this begins a series of evangelistic efforts by an unlikely apostle. Paul himself says, I'm an apostle born out of season. I'm not the kind you normally expect. From a standpoint of like a strategic purpose thing. Does it make sense to have a super Jew be the apostle to the Gentiles? He's a Pharisee of Pharisees. From the highest edges of his tribe. trained to be at the highest pillar of power in his culture, I'm not going to send you to them. In fact, I'm going to send you far away from them, is what ends up happening. His habits don't change, but his area of work does. And so Paul himself is born in Tarsus of Cilicia. It's located between two mountain passes. The Syrian gates go into Cilicia. They're a major part really in this area of what we would consider Asia Minor. We're looking at our map and thinking about it. And Paul himself is identified very early on when he's talking to Hebrew audiences, Saul in that context, loyal to the law. Really so much so that he is willing to engage in what the law of the land would say is illegal. Because remember, in the trial concerning Christ, the Jews go to their earthly king and say, we can't put him to death. We can't do this. We don't have the authority to do so. You scoot forward just a few chapters, the same ruling body gives Paul the authority to do what? Arrest Christians, try them, and as people are stoning Christians to death, Paul says, let me hold your cloaks for that. Let me make this easy for that. Now there's a lot of folks who will suggest that that's a metaphor for him offering like sanction of behavior. We don't need that. It may or may not be historically. But realistically, as he does that, he's basically saying, I approve. Like that. Aside from whether this was a legitimate, true sanction of behavior in Jewish first century context, any reader is going to look at it and go, yeah, he absolutely is in favor of it because he incited the action. He brought them to this. He put pressure on other Christians to try to rat out their relatives and their fellow believers. And he is in this position of power. So much so that he becomes known. Got to think about that for a second and how difficult it is to become a known person in an era that does not have the same types of interconnectedness that we're so familiar with. If you think back to 50s to 70s, even into the 80s, and we'll pick one historical event, D.B. Cooper. You guys know the story of D.B. Cooper? Everyone kind of knows that story roughly. Nobody is quite sure exactly who this particular bank thief was. And in part of his extortion plan and actions, he decided that in order to escape, he was going to hijack an airplane and take the money with him and jump out of the plane while it was in air. And all that we have actually found is some of the money that he stole has washed up in the edge of Oregon and Washington. No other true evidence of his crime has been found that I'm aware of. It could have changed. I don't follow it very carefully. But we have a lot of hand-drawn sketches of what he looks like. That's all we really have. It's like, well, this flight attendant says he looks like this, and this person said he looked like that. But we're not quite sure. It's still listed in the unsolved category. We know that theft occurred. We know extortion occurred or blackmail, however we want to box it up. But we don't know. This was in relatively recent times with national news, with an artist's sketch, with people who saw him and talked to him. We don't know. First century, Paul's reputation amongst the Christian community due to his violent disposition versus them is so well known that without all the advantages of the 21st century way of communicating, everybody knows. Everybody knows who he is, even when he goes farther and farther from where he is well known. Even when he's out in the middle of nowhere town. Realistically speaking, months of travel away. You think about his level of notoriety has gotten so high, even early on in his interaction with the biblical story. And in the middle of that, Christ appears to Paul on his way to Damascus. His work, his plan, I'm going to make this sect who follow Jesus go away because they are a threat to the law. He never looks back at, by the way, afterwards and says, I was doing this because I wanted to maintain power. I was doing this because I didn't like them. He was doing it, in his own words, with a clear conscience, because he believed it was right and that they were wrong. Like, it's really simplified in the New Testament story. And God then chooses Paul as his chosen messenger. Says this is who it's going to be. Paul was then immersed. Remember, this is a sequence in the Bible when baptism takes place in every single instance in the New Testament. The individual being baptized submits to baptism. That helps us kind of get a good idea of what's going on there. This is a choice where you give into it. And that's the highest level of understanding in that picture. So Paul submits to baptism. He then spends the rest of his life preaching and teaching the gospel. Now, Damascus is, according to every edge of either biblical history or recorded history otherwise, the oldest continually occupied city that we know about. That from its beginning till now, it continues to be occupied in the same frame. And by the way, Acts chapter 9 and verse 8 ties us into the story. And they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And so this is a relatively more, obviously it's an aerial photo of Damascus as it's laid out. And they brought him into the city, and we can kind of see it here. It's important because the street called Straight is going to be mentioned in the text. And here's an outline of the city as it would have been roughly during the time of Paul's presence there. So this is the new city on the outside, old city on the inside. And it says there, Acts chapter 9 and verse 11, arise and go to the street which is called Straight. This photo is from about 1920-ish, I think, from the archives that I've got a hold of. This is the street called Straight. Same spot. Obviously, buildings, things can change over time, but the location of the street has not. Same spot. So if you're asking a question, and Al and I were talking about this last week, hey, sometimes when you're thinking about historical events, you go, I think it may have happened around here somewhere, like somewhere within 50 miles maybe, or 100 feet from here. Well, in this case, Paul walked there somewhere. Apostle Paul on that street. Geographically, logistically, there. Much like when you go in other places of history and say, hey, it was right here. This is where this took place. This is the spot. This is the location. And at different times throughout history, it looks much like streets do today. If you were to go today to Israel right now and walk on the way of the cross, the Via Dolorosa, it almost always looks this crowded. Every time that I've been there, that's what it looks like. Crowded up with lots of people. It's a packed-in place, kind of scrunched in. And obviously, this is an older photo, so there's no one riding on horses there. But in Damascus, this older photo shows us again, this is a place where Paul engaged in the moments we read about. And if you were to go there today, you would see very much the same kind of compressed area. And it's a straight street that goes right through the community. Paul is a Roman citizen. And that gave him special advantages that not everyone would have had. Keep in mind, the Roman Empire, heavily broken out, for our purposes, two major classes. A large chunk of various individuals enslaved, with either time limits to their slavery as they're paying off a debt, or other reasons why they have been put into servitude. Some by choice, some by conquest, etc. A large chunk of foreign-born folks then serve in the military to become citizens. That creates a big class of citizenry in Rome. Paul doesn't identify with either of those two groups in his background. He says that his citizenship was due to his birth. That elevated him above those two other groups in the sense of class. I am a Roman by birth, not one who has purchased it, not one who had served for it. I am a Roman in the fullest sense, which is odd. One odd, supremely so, for a Pharisee who is a Jew living in Jerusalem in the conflict zone where the zealots would be trying to kill anyone who expressed Roman leanings or tendencies. And so he takes advantage later on, we'll see this next 22, of this status and say, I'm going to appeal to the highest court in the land because I have every right to. Appealing to Caesar didn't necessarily mean that Caesar would solve the problem. You were appealing to the court system in Rome. You're saying, hey, I want to appeal up here. Now, eventually it very well could sit at the feet of the emperor or his lower subordinates. But now these rules apply. So number one, he could not be treated unfairly. He had to be given equitable food, status, and actually protection. Because now everybody else is accountable to his care. The way in which he was executed also then shifted out as well as to what would be appropriate. But back to his work. After he began preaching, his transformation, begins preaching. He starts in the synagogues of Damascus. Arabia, by the way, appeals to that whole Arabian desert region. Later on, he would come back into the city of Damascus to preach. And now the Jews, who were once his allies, ready to go persecute the Christians, are like, hey, Paul, what's the deal? I thought you were here to do what we agreed upon. So from the Jewish perspective, he is effectively what we would call a traitor. He is a traitor to the law, a traitor to the country, a traitor to the idea of a restored Jerusalem and Israelite kingdom. So it does not make much of a surprise that, to the most part, they want him gone. Because he has influence, right? He had power before, and anyone who doesn't know who he was, like he's of this change, they're going to give him a little extra care. They tried to have him arrested. He escapes over the wall of a city in a basket. That was not how he had been treated up to that point. Up to that point, he had a place of privilege and honor. Afterwards, this is going to become a regular occurrence for him. Eventually, he would come back to Jerusalem, and everyone's like, come on. We know who you are. You were present when Stephen was murdered. Now, we say politely the stoning of Stephen, right? He was murdered and martyred. He was killed not because he was a troublemaker, not because of some illegal activity, not because he was a bad guy. He was killed because he left Judaism as a method of religion because it had been fulfilled in Christ and declared that Jesus was the Messiah. As such, the Jews who refused to consider and accept the message killed him. So that crowd included individuals who were still involved in the first century church there in Jerusalem. And then we encounter Barnabas. Barnabas serves as the friend that we all wish that we were and had. Think about Barnabas for a second. Without Barnabas, we don't have this peaceful interaction. Doesn't mean it's a perfect interaction, but it becomes a peaceful one. Because Paul eventually is able to address the assembled group of Christians together. And can you think about how uncomfortable that would be for anyone related to Stephen? Anyone who had maybe served tables with him? How would you feel if someone that you had sacrificed with was put to death by this guy and he's going to come speak at church the next Sunday? Because literally that's the cycle here. Time frame's a little displaced. Raise your hand if you're uncomfortable like me. I would straight up be uncomfortable with it, 100%. Even though intellectually I can put all the pieces together, it doesn't change the way I feel. Doesn't change the emotions. Even if all the other things that you come up with are like, yeah, that makes sense, that's rational, that's reasonable. It's still uncomfortable. Barnabas is then the friend that we all wish we were, and the friend that we all desperately want to have. Later, he's told, you got to get out. You can't start or preach here in Jerusalem. Which also helps us probably understand why Paul becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. He's never actually really welcome anymore in Jewish culture. He keeps trying because he cares. He writes about that in his letter to the Romans and his letters to the church at Corinth to a degree. I wish that all of Israel would be saved, if even it meant my own loss. So we kind of get his motivation for his behavior. Because when Paul gets to a town, by the way, in our New Testament text, what's Paul's method of operations? Paul's arriving in Coweta County tomorrow. What do you think the first thing he's going to do if Paul came into here? Find a synagogue, right? Going to go to the synagogue. Step number one. Okay, what if there's no synagogue in Coweta County? What's his next behavior?
Find out where people are gathering to do religious things.
Find out where are they talking about religion? I'm going to go there. You might say he probably would have done a thing first before he got here is write churches a letter. Because Paul wrote a lot of letters to churches and say, hey, straighten up. That's probably a fair thing too. The letter might have gone something like, hey, Timothy says hi. You guys need to straighten up, get your behavior right, etc. But that's probably the sequence, because that's his behavior. And he keeps doing that over and over again in spite of knowing what the outcomes were going to be. He then engages in work in that region, you catch it, where he's from. Cilicia, Acts chapter 9, Acts chapter 22 is referring back to it. Galatians chapter 1 refers to him. He's going to eventually, by the way, in chapter 9, go to Caesarea. He'll be back there again in his life, but it won't be so pleasant the second time he's there, or the last time he's there. That's when he's in chains going to Rome. It'll be a different experience. But the church of Jerusalem would then send Barnabas to Antioch to exhort the new congregation of disciples there. He goes to Tarsus to get Paul to help him in the work. And for a year, they will work together, labor together in the kingdom, first there in Antioch. Then a group of men from Jerusalem come to Antioch. A man named Agabus predicted a plague or a dearth in the empire. Brethren in Antioch sent relief to the brethren in Judea. They had been the ones who received that persecution early on from Jerusalem's Jewish population. And they were still now impoverished. Almost everybody is. But the gift goes back to this region by the hands of Barnabas and Paul. And so Acts chapter 13 and 14 now is kind of focusing in on a narrower space. Covers a time period of about 2 to 3 years of work. In this range, the larger range of 45 to 48, Paul begins this work in Antioch. It's going to eventually expand some as he makes travel to Salamis, that's going across the water to the island of Cyprus. There he will engage in his regular practice of preaching to the Jews there in the synagogue. And we see that kind of laying out for us. Then we shift our perspective to the other side of the island, Paphos. That's about 150 miles from Salamis. On the other end, in the text, we'll hear an individual, Sergius Paulus, has decided to hear the word of the Lord. Elymas is going to show up and try to turn him away from the faith in Acts 13. And this is, in text space, the first time that Saul is referred to as Paul in our reading. That's also, it seems, when Paul starts seeming to be more around Greek-named Jewish culture rather than Hebrew-named Jewish culture. And so the shift that's taking place here is basically everybody who speaks Greek, they call him Paul. Everyone who spoke Greek and Hebrew, which would have been how it was, would have called him Saul. As a way to think about these pieces being laid out together here. And now, it is Paul and Barnabas, not Barnabas and Saul. So there's been some adjustment in the way in which Luke records the story for us. Because the work focus shifts. Where it used to focus on them together, or Barnabas' role, now the work is really focusing on what Paul does. Of note historically, we think about Elymas here in Acts 13 and verse 6. It says in one of the text translations, a certain magician, a Jewish false prophet whose name was also Bar-Jesus. This right here is a bowl that includes an Aramaic inscription and the imagery of a demon. This is found in Nippur somewhere around 6th, 7th century AD. But when you can kind of peek into it, you'll see the highlight there is that this is a, for lack of better terminology, a spell. It's not exactly a spell in the way in which Jewish magicians functioned, but for our modern kind of thought process, this is a curse that if you invoke these words, engage in the ritual appropriately, the presumption is that you would then bring a pox, a curse, upon their family. And so if you're curious, hey, what would have been going on? What's the record about this kind of classifications of folks? This is the same kind of behavior, a little bit delayed in history, but it's a representation of what he would have done. His work probably was not in pottery inscribed, it was in books and written in that regard. But that's what's going on. This is the kind of thing that Paul is rejecting. This is the kind of thing that the false prophets and others would engage in this era. Also there in the book of Acts, we see the name Sergius Paulus pop up. This is a boundary marker that is from the era of around 41 to 47. And in order to make it easy for us, there's Sergius Paulus's name showing up in this boundary marker from the area. How many of you have been to the edges of your property and seen the city stakes that kind of lay out where the end of your land is? How big of a deal is it to get that spot right? It's a pretty big deal, right? Because on the one side, that determines what you're going to be taxed. And so you want it to be exactly correct. If I'm getting taxed on this land, I want to be taxed on my land. And so we have developed an entire system to ensure that those things are correct. Well, to a certain degree, that's what's going on here. These boundary markers that are existing throughout the Roman Empire define both realms of authority, who's in charge, but on the inside of it, it's who's taxed. And so these individuals who lived inside the boundary markers, their tax dollars would come up through their leadership stream to go back to Rome. And so there's some similarity, you can think about it in this regard. Or if you wanted a different way to think about it, every time you leave the state of Georgia and you go to another state, you see a sign on the side of the road that says, welcome to Florida, welcome to Alabama. And on the way back in, it says, welcome to Georgia. Very much a similar edge of things. If you're leaving Louisiana and going into Texas, you didn't need the sign because that's when the roads got smooth and flat. And so it was that way back in the 90s. It's still the way now. It's just how it is. They just kind of smoothed out. The roads in Louisiana are hard to maintain, or they don't want to spend the money on it and never figured it out. But these signs catch back to the biblical text and say, hey, this is a real person, a real thing, a real context. Back to Paul's journey, as we're thinking about this map of circumstances, he goes from the island of Cyprus, from Salamis and Paphos, up to Perga. That's about 12 miles inland from the coast, with another 150 miles. Again, we're talking about journey distances that seem easy for us. And you could go to 150 miles in a day and never leave Atlanta, just driving around in circles. And it probably would take you a whole day to spend 150 miles in Atlanta. This is a lot larger endeavor to travel either by land or by sea. But John Mark, at this moment, the writer of Mark, turns back and says, this is too much for me. I can't do it. It's easy to feel like Paul when we read this story and say, he deserted me. But I want you to think about, first start about when you're young and the first time you went away from home and how you felt homesick. Even if it was just for a little bit. Some was like, I never felt homesick whatsoever. You're lying. You absolutely did. You've just forgotten that sense of disconcertedness where it doesn't feel right. Generally, they suggest, and I tend to agree, that homesickness isn't that you don't like where you are, it's that you miss the comfort and familiarity of where you were. It doesn't feel safe anymore, and it felt safe back then. That's something where, when you're dealing with an 11-year-old, 12-year-old kid who's homesick, you can tell him, yeah, it's just Tuesday and you're tired, and your mom's going to be here Friday, it's going to be fun. That's usually kind of the camp experience for lots of kids. That's not going on here for John Mark. He has a deep appreciation for spiritual things. He's involved in kingdom work, but now the work is getting harder and harder. You see, when you were homesick, were you also watching your compatriots and yourself be beaten or tossed out of places, led over the edge of cities with baskets because of what you were doing? Man, it sounds like adventure when it's on a page, but when it's in your hands and your feet, it's suffering. And so it's easy, like, again, Paul, to be hard on this. And Paul's feelings are legitimate too. He needed that support, and then it was now twice as hard. But then you have Barnabas on the other end, who once again becomes the kind of friend that we wish we were and wish that we had when he encourages John Mark later. From Perga, we go to Pisidia. It goes more inland as it's kind of going up. That's Antioch, by the way. 100 miles by foot or by other means of conveyance. Paul would preach there at least 2 Sabbaths in Acts 13. It would also provide for us the first recorded sermon of Paul. Based on your surface knowledge off the top of your head, did Paul preach short sermons or long sermons? We equate them absolutely long. He writes letters and he has to say, well, and for the last thing, and the last thing, and the last thing. He says that 3 times in the closing of one of his letters, his one more thing method. But his actual recorded sermons aren't long, as they're recorded for us. You could read them in a few minutes, all of them. So you've got to understand that because they include this clause. And then, just like it was in Acts chapter 2, many other things are said. You're getting a synopsis of whatever it was he was going after, a short version of what the message was. But this is our first recorded sermon, where he again engages in preaching. And the sermons of, by the way, Peter and Stephen, the one that Paul also heard, they have the same general thematic train, the same basic concepts. the same general ideas. While in Antioch of Pisidia, Paul was invited to speak at the synagogue of the Jews. Many of those Jews were impressed with the messages, as were Gentiles who were present in the synagogue, which happens far more the farther away you get from Jerusalem. They wanted to hear more. Now, the second time, nearly the whole city is assembled to listen to him. And the Jews are like, wait a minute, we can't be having this. We cannot have this going down, because this shifts it to the Jews are identified as, in this group of community of Jews, are now jealous of what he's doing. And their behavior matches it. They act like you would think a jealous person might behave. The Gentiles listen readily. The Jews are like, we got to cause trouble, expelled from the city. This really then becomes the very first recorded amount of suffering and persecution for their preaching in this particular trip. It goes from encouragement to evangelism. The area here is about 2/3 the size of the second largest state. Remember, Alaska is actually the largest state in the Union. Texans will always differ with you on that, independent of the facts. They say, no, Texas is the biggest state. Great, okay. But then for our purposes, though, this region that Paul is going to work in is actually about 2/3. Now, you can drive from one edge of Texas to another edge of Texas and spend a day doing so. You can go from El Paso to the edge of Arkansas, and you could probably spend a good 24 hours making that journey and not break a speed limit, and you'll probably spend that whole day. Now, I'm just off the top of my head, rough number, that feels about right. You'll also pass about 12 Buc-ee's in that time frame, maybe 15. And you think about, Paul's in a group smaller than that doing his work. A large amount of the time that Paul is in these areas when he is not self-supporting is traveling from place to place. So he journeys to preach in these regions. Asia Minor, this whole section here, as we narrow it down, 9 provinces make it even smaller. The province of Asia, the province of Galatia. They refer to them in these areas, and so these are large regional spaces that Paul is working in. My clock says we have 1 minute left of time approximately before the cutoff is, and so we'll have to stop right here. We'll pick up with more of this journey next Sunday to make sure we cover this section as well. Any last thoughts or questions before our time closes up? All right, as always, if you've got other things you'd like to talk about for the class, come talk to me. Happy to interact with you and work together, and if necessary, we'll include it next